Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a truly fascinating contradiction. We're looking at a massive, seemingly endless, and absolutely resource-rich landmass. Yet it possesses a microeconomy so incredibly small that it barely even registers on global charts. But here's the biggest paradox of all. Somehow, this quiet, isolated territory has global superpowers aggressively vying for influence and strategic control.
So let's dive headfirst into this massive paradox. We really have to ask ourselves, why do the world's absolute biggest players, like the United States, care so deeply about an island that, economically speaking, produces less total financial activity than many single zip codes in the USA? It's a question that forces us to look past the surface and really examine the hidden mechanics of global geopolitics.
Which brings us to Section 1, the Great Greenland Paradox.
Now, the sheer, undeniable scale of this contradiction is just staggering. You have this giant, sprawling territory taking up a huge portion of the map, right? Yet its economic output is roughly 9,000 times smaller than the United States. Actually, it has half the GDP per capita of a neighboring island like Iceland. In fact, if we look at the raw numbers, Greenland wouldn't just struggle to maintain its high-income economy without foreign help, it would legitimately struggle to maintain its very existence.
Let's move on to Section 2, the Kingdom of Denmark.
While we often talk about Greenland as its own distinct place, it is technically part of the Kingdom of Denmark. It's a really fascinating setup. See, Greenland has its own parliament and a prime minister who handles domestic affairs. But the top-level policy? Well, that's made by the Danish prime minister back in Europe. And for crucial issues, like freedom of movement within the European Union, Greenlanders are effectively considered Danish citizens.
There's a quote that brilliantly illustrates the dynamic playing out on the world stage right now. It describes Greenland as the geopolitical equivalent of a dependent child that still relies on their parents for an allowance. And it's true. Despite operating as its own country in many day-to-day respects, Greenland relies heavily on Denmark to foot the bill for essential services. Denmark acts as this vital lifeline, providing the continuous stream of funding that keeps this incredibly isolated economy completely afloat.
That brings us to Section 3, a tiny, remote economy.
To put things into perspective, the total economic output of Greenland sits at just $3.3 billion US. The largest city there is essentially the size of a small village in most other countries. The landscape is so incredibly remote and inhospitable that building out modern advanced industries, the kind that typically generate massive GDP, is practically impossible. It just makes more sense for those industries to stay in mainland Europe. And here's the real kicker. Almost half of the entire tiny workforce in Greenland is employed by some level of government. In a sprawling, highly developed nation, that number would be absolutely staggering. But here, in a small, simple economy, it highlights a heavy reliance on Danish financial transfers. Many economists would actually argue this functions as a form of rebranded welfare, keeping employment high in areas where the private market simply can't reach.
And the government's reach doesn't stop at direct employment. Because the population is so spread out across this harsh terrain, Denmark is practically forced to heavily subsidize basic private necessities. We are talking about subsidizing remote grocery store chains literally just so people can buy food. We're talking about government-funded domestic flights on Greenland Air, connecting communities that live far away from the quote-unquote hustle and bustle of the 25,000-person capital. It is an incredibly expensive undertaking just to maintain a baseline, high-income quality of life.
Which naturally leads us to Section 4, why superpowers want it.
So why does the US care? Well, the answer lies right beneath the surface. Greenland sits on an immense, staggering wealth of unexploited natural resources. We are talking about highly sought-after rare earth metals, precious metals like rubies, sapphires, and diamonds, and massive deposits of oil and natural gas. It is, quite literally, a treasure trove waiting to be opened. Now, traditionally, the harsh climate and endless ice made getting to these resources nearly impossible. But, and this is a huge shift, a retreating ice sheet is actively changing the game. It's suddenly becoming easier to extract these raw materials and, crucially, to build the transport infrastructure required to actually move them to global markets. However, extracting them profitably is still a formidable hurdle. Right now, there's literally only one active mine in the whole country extracting anorthosite for rock wool insulation. Plus, the local population of 57,000 is highly wary of their home being transformed into some remote industrial mining outpost for foreign powers.
Let's look at Section 5, the Strategic Arctic Outpost.
Beyond just the physical resources buried in the rock, as global ice melts, entirely new Arctic shipping lanes are opening up. These new routes cut thousands of miles off traditional trade journeys between major global markets. This is a massive strategic advantage. Russia, which has historically been desperate for ocean access, has been aggressively pushing to utilize these lanes. The United States, on the other hand, wants to ensure it can protect its own regional influence and keep these vital new trade arteries totally secure.
And the U.S. isn't just looking at Greenland from afar. They already have a significant footprint right there. The Thule Air Base, which has been operational since the 1950s, is now run by the U.S. Space Force. It currently houses roughly 600 personnel.
What's really interesting is that this military presence directly fuels the local economy. Because Greenland falls under the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark is part of NATO, the U.S. operates this incredibly strategic base without actually paying direct rent. However, having more than 1% of the entire country's population stationed at this single military base functions as a massive international service export. It provides vital domestic contracting jobs and injects capital into the local economy. So it cements an invaluable strategic foothold for the United States while quietly supporting Greenland's bottom line.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, the economic scorecard.
I love this breakdown because it perfectly summarizes the entire paradox we've been exploring today. Look at those extremes. A terrible 1 out of 10 for size and industry because of its heavy reliance on government jobs, but right next to it, an impressive 8 for GDP per capita and a 7 for stability. It is a highly developed, stable democracy with fantastic wealth per capita, entirely thanks to its unique, subsidized relationship with Denmark. Growth sits safely right in the middle at a 5, currently getting a nice little boost from fishing and adventurous tourism.
Averaging all those metrics out, Greenland lands a 4.4 out of 10. It's such a fascinating score for a territory that would genuinely struggle to exist independently, yet remains a prime, highly coveted target for intense superpower ambitions and geopolitical strategy.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. While we see superpowers constantly eyeing its resources and shipping lanes, modern territory purchases have largely fallen out of favor globally, the last one actually being a tiny uninhabited island back in 2017. For the U.S. to ever truly claim Greenland, it would require Greenland to first untangle itself from Denmark and then actively choose to join another foreign power. Ultimately, the geopolitical future of this giant, resource-rich paradox rests entirely in the hands of its 57,000 citizens. Will they chart an independent course, or will they become the next great strategic prize of the 21st century? Thank you so much for exploring with me today, and I'll catch you in the next one.